This episode is brought to you in part by the Apologetics Guy Show, the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about Christianity. Learn to explain your faith with courage and compassion. Join Moody Bible Institute professor Dr. Mikel Del Rosario at apologeticsguy.com.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals in the United States tied themselves to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. It can't stand on its own, but it will make more sense within the context of Season 6. This is Milton Friedman v. John Maynard Keynes. It's the first of two parts. The People's Party, also known as the Populists, started in Texas with ranchers and farmers trying to scratch out a living in the late 1800s. A third political party to challenge the Democrats and Republicans. When bankers, railroads, and middlemen conspired to undercut farmers, they formed co-ops to fight for better crop prices and loan rates. The People's Party sprang out of the need to seek legal protections through the federal government, the same government offering cover for railroad monopolies. They had a serious run for the presidency with William Jennings Bryan, but he lost, and the party withered. Decades later came the Great Depression, which hit farmers well before the rest of the country. The 1920s brought terribly low prices. In some districts, crops were sold at the same price they'd gotten during the Middle Ages. In one 5-year period ending in 1932, 1 in 8 farms were up for sale due to unpaid mortgages or taxes. According to historian Robert Caro, even before the Depression, the pleas of those involved in agriculture fell on deaf ears in the Harding and Coolidge administrations. Farmers asked for lower tariffs so that foreign products could be cheaper for them to buy. President Coolidge vetoed the reform because, according to him, it violated the sacred principles of laissez-faire. Essentially, the idea that markets should be free from government intervention. Though that same day, President Coolidge passed an increase on pig iron tariffs, thus protecting big business and ignoring the little people. Hypocrisy is a son of a gun. Crop prices fell so low that farmers let produce rot on the vine. They would actually lose money by harvesting. Meanwhile, an incredible number of Americans waited on bread lines. The Bonus Army marched on Washington to ask that the promised bonuses for their efforts in World War I be advanced to them. They were met with bayonets and tear gas. President Hoover refused to see them, maintaining that the economy was sound. According to Caro in his book, The Path to Power,
when delegations came to the White House begging him to endorse federal aid for relief or increase spending on public works, he refused. "As long as I sit at this desk, they won't get by," he said. He couldn't bear to watch suffering, so he never visited a bread line or a relief station. As his limousine swept past men selling apples on street corners, he never turned his head to look at them.
Congress eventually passed a public works bill, but Hoover characterized it as an unexpected raid on the public treasure, saying, "We cannot squander ourselves into prosperity." Asked why so many formerly employed men sold apples on street corners, he replied,
"Many people have left their jobs for the more profitable one of selling apples."
When his train rolled through the nation on his re-election campaign, it was pelted with eggs and tomatoes. In his first run, he took 48 states. In his second, he carried only 6. Measures to preserve the gold standard during bank runs exacerbated the problem, prompting farmers to sing, "Let's call a farmer's holiday. A holiday we'll hold. We'll eat our wheat and ham and eggs, and let them eat their gold." Marches erupted, protests. There were legitimate fears of a red uprising in the country as 35,000 people met for a communist rally in New York's Union Square. There was concern that capitalism had reached its end in this country, as Americans starved to death while others let crops rot in the fields. Banks were bailed out while children were too hungry to attend school. Something had to be done. What happened next spurred two different ways of seeing the economy, the way of John Maynard Keynes and that of Milton Friedman. And Friedman sold politically connected evangelicals a tempting apple of his own, that free markets could solve all their problems. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truths.
My name is Jennifer Burns. I'm an associate professor of history at Stanford University and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. I'm the author of Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and the American Right, and the newly published Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative.
Which is the book we're talking about today. Patrons of the show can hear a bonus episode where we discuss her research on Ayn Rand. Milton Friedman, the subject of our episode today, was an economist and kind of a celebrity in the 1970s and 80s, appearing on his own program and on talk shows like Donahue. We'll get there. But he came of age in a dark time in world history. You're about to hear some big words, but don't worry. We'll walk through them together.
So he was in college when the Great Depression unfolded, and he started graduate school in 1932, really the worst part of the Great Depression. So it shifted him towards economics because he thought he could get some answers as to what was happening. Then really explaining the Great Depression became the sort of central focus of his career. And in graduate school, he learned to think about it through the lens of money and banking as a problem in the banking system. And then he was finishing graduate school when the Keynesian interpretation arose that, as it was understood in America, tended to cast the Great Depression as more of a systemic failure of capitalism, and one that required a more expanded federal government role to ensure economic prosperity.
Okay, so a lot to tackle there, but let's work our way through it. The Great Depression arrived on the coattails of a long series of boom and bust cycles, ending in financial panic. To get us out of the Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt and Congress went on a spending spree through a series of programs known as the New Deal. Building roads, dams, trails, creating art, documenting that historic moment, birthing new agencies, and starting programs like government-backed home loans and the FDIC. And some of these programs were administered disproportionately to white people. Importantly, the New Deal also helped working people with protections for unions. Essentially, the goal was for the government to increase its spending, thus creating more demand for goods and services, and then, hopefully, spurring on the economy. John Maynard Keynes, who Jennifer Burns mentioned, was an economist around that time. He argued that in a time of depressions, government should lower taxes and spend money to increase demand in the economy. Essentially, what we did in the New Deal, and with the recession of 2007-2008. Because otherwise, we'd fall into a vicious cycle. If the economy is bad, we're likely to save our money. If we're saving, we're not out buying stuff. Then the factories that make that stuff don't have as much business. So they'll have to lay off workers or lower their pay. Then those people don't have money to buy stuff, and this whole thing spirals out of control. Keynesianism tasks the government with pulling the economy out of a tailspin. Create jobs through big government projects like building bridges and roads. And when those construction workers get off work, they'll have money in their pockets that they can use to buy stuff. Which gives money to the shopkeeper, who pays the suppliers, and hopefully, prosperity spreads. It gets more complicated than that, but let's keep it simple. Keynes died young and didn't get to defend a lot of his ideas, and his followers spun some of those things into a lot of different directions. But let's stop there. Some conservatives complain that government involvement in the economy was a sign of rising communism. Others argue that the only way to stop the mobs from copying the Russian Revolution was to offer federal aid. Was the New Deal a sign of socialism or an effort to stop socialism? Or both? The approach of Keynes or Roosevelt put thousands of people back to work, built the nation's infrastructure, and kept food on tables across the country through government intervention, prompting some to label Keynesianism depression economics. And yeah, that came with a big cost, bringing us back to Milton Friedman.
And Friedman disagreed with that from the beginning. And so a lot of his academic work became about questioning that Keynesian idea, talking about alternate ways to understand the Great Depression.
Friedman was born in 1912 and grew up in New Jersey, studied at Rutgers, and then went on to our old friend, the University of Chicago. At the time, the American home of modernist theology, and for a while, the school of Leopold and Loeb from last season. Then Milton was off to Columbia University. He eventually taught at the University of Chicago and worked to staff it with like-minded, laissez-faire economists.
So in economics, he's best known for, first of all, being an exponent of what has been called Chicago price theory.
Simpler than it sounds. Chicago because he taught at the University of Chicago. So Chicago price theory...
This is analyzing human behavior through an economic lens. And what made Friedman's approach and that of his colleagues and his students distinctive was to really take the economic mode of analysis and apply it much more broadly than it ever had been before.
Seeing the whole world, like almost anything, and trying to view it through an economic lens. Like everything.
So instead of looking at something, say, how do economic ideas tell us about the price of shoes? Or why a piano is more expensive than a children's dress? They would take it and say, isn't marriage kind of like a market? Or maybe we can explain gambling through economic analysis. Or maybe we can use prices to improve social welfare.
This is not an idea that Friedman invented. It predated him, but he adopted it. What made it interesting is how far Friedman took this idea.
What was more original in his contribution was the school of thought called monetarism.
Monetarism, another big, scary term. The central component of monetarism is the question of how we deal with inflation. Okay, so what is inflation? Let's say last year I went to my favorite taco stand to buy one bean burrito for $2. Today I think I'd like to have another. I go back and today that same burrito costs $2.10. 10 cents more than last year. That increase, when taken across a whole bunch of products, not just one, is inflation. I can now buy less with my money. If my pay doesn't go up to match inflation, my paycheck buys fewer things. Inflation generally isn't good for consumers. What Friedman does is dust off an old idea that had gone out of fashion.
And this is best summarized by the dictum, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon.
Oh, so, what does that mean?
What does that mean? It sounds interesting. Because oh, sure, inflation has to do with money. Yeah, doesn't everyone know that? So when Friedman was starting out, there wasn't a lot of academic work done, a lot of research done on what caused inflation, in part because there had been few episodes of inflation outside of wartime in the United States. And people tended to think, well, inflation happens when, unions push for higher wages, or inflation happens when there's a bottleneck in one part of the economy. And Friedman said, no, inflation is really, it's not just a few prices going up. First of all, it's all prices going up consistently across the economy. And it has to do with the quantity of money that is available.
How much money is out there in the entire economy? Let's say that there are 50 pennies on a table. These pennies represent all the money in the country. They're going to be really valuable because there are only 50 of them in the entire country. They're rare. If I want to buy a house, we'll say it's 1 penny. 1/50th of all the money in the whole country. Must be a nice house. Now, what if we were to add another 50 pennies into the supply? In the United States, this would be the job of the Federal Reserve, controlling how much money is in circulation. Let's say I want to buy that same house. Last time I paid 1/50th of all the money in the country to buy this mansion. But now there is twice as much money, which means instead of paying 1 penny, I have to pay 2 to equal 1/50th of the money supply. Because in this scenario, the Federal Reserve raised the amount of money in the country, it devalues the currency. My 1 penny isn't enough to buy a house. It now takes more money to buy the same product. That's inflation at work. The old theory, reworked by Friedman, goes that by controlling how much money is in circulation, the Fed essentially controls the rate of inflation. Make sense?
And if there is more money available, prices will tend to go up. And if there is less money available, prices will tend to go down. So it's almost a truism. It's almost a syllogism. And it's been observed, this quantity theory of money, in many different historical times and places.
Inflation will be super important in a few episodes when we talk about Jimmy Carter in the 1970s. I'm trying to prepare you for something that's coming up in the future. Tuck this away for later.
What came out of that critically was, well, what should the government do about inflation?
Let's slow that down for a second. What should the government do about inflation? Now, that implies a few things. That the government can do something about inflation, and that it should do something. That's what followers of Keynes would argue. The government can, and they should. They should make adjustments, raise and lower the amount of money out there, tinker with the interest rates. According to Friedman,
the government should ensure a stable monetary framework and stable monetary policy.
To Friedman, all of this market trouble came from one place. In his mind, governments caused financial panics with all their monkeying around with the financial system, adjusting interest rates, deciding how much money is in this giant pool. Remember, in the United States, the governing body that does this is the Federal Reserve. Milton did not like this playing around with the economy. He wanted to set a rule about how much was out there and leave it there. Set it and forget it.
So it shouldn't use the Federal Reserve, or it shouldn't use its ability to print money to try to stimulate the economy or to try to slow it down, because that would have all kinds of very bad effects. And printing a little more money to make everybody feel a little more rich, Friedman argued, is just going to create inflation. And once inflation starts, it's very hard to stop.
Instead, they should keep the quantity of new money going into the system at a constant. Then the free market would do what it needed to do, and in his mind, this policy would deter boom and bust cycles. He called all this monetarism. Because it deals with money.
In Friedman's day, there was a lot of talk about using rules versus discretion. So his idea was that the Federal Reserve should say, let's grow the money supply at 4% a year.
Friedman argued that instead of letting a government body tinker with the money supply depending on the state of the economy, we'll lock it in at 4% growth every year. 4% more pennies on the table. Are we in good times? 4%. Bad times? 4%. Don't monkey with it.
No matter what. No matter what's happening, we're going to aim for 4% a year. And the sort of previous thinking would have been, oh, well, if things are slow, maybe we should push up to 6% a year. And then maybe if we're getting inflation, let's try to go down to 3% a year. And he said the problem with that, this is another famous Friedman saying, is monetary policy acts with a long and variable lag.
It's hard to anticipate what difference our little adjustments make because it takes so long for them to play out. It could be months or even years before the effect really registers. Hence, the lag. Friedman brought these discussions about the Federal Reserve to the attention of the public. It had been kind of a secretive organization. Friedman wanted to shine a light on it, and then to do away with it.
Yeah, sometimes for people who are familiar with Ron Paul's and the Fed crusade that, kind of shot up in the aughts, Friedman is the original and the Fed guy. He would be called into Congress and just excoriate the Fed up and down, say they don't know what they're doing, their policy's all wrong. And most famously of all, working with his collaborator Anna Schwartz, they presented an analysis of the Great Depression that really laid the Great Depression at the feet of the Federal Reserve.
I covered this last season with Jacob Goldstein in my second episode about the gold standard, if you want to go back and take a deep dive. Friedman pointed out that the Fed's attempts to preserve the gold standard are what exacerbated the Depression. Friedman did not like the gold standard. This is one area where modern conservatives disagree with Friedman. His ideas are not universally loved. Those who follow Keynes want the government to have options to curb inflation. And while nobody's arguing that the Fed is perfect, giving control of interest rates to Congress or the president opens up the possibility of using interest rates for political purposes. Like so many philosophies, there are blind spots. Friedman's work became interested not just in money, but really everything, including areas that today's conservatives probably wouldn't follow him, and a worship of freedom that bordered on obsessive. I'll continue the story after these messages. While you listen to the ads, take a moment to subscribe to the show so you get every new episode as it's released. It's a simple and free way to support this project. But did I mention it's free? It is, so why not subscribe? Okay, here we go. Welcome back, Truce Podcast, talking about Milton Friedman. Friedman went mainstream in 1962 with a book he co-authored with his wife Rose, Capitalism and Freedom. In that book, without going too into the weeds, essentially, Friedman advocated for free markets. That the market's naturally correct for things, and therefore, we don't need that much in the way of government intervention. Here's an actor reading from Capitalism and Freedom.
A major source of objection to a free economy is precisely that it does this task so well. It gives people what they want instead of what a particular group thinks they ought to want. Underlying most arguments against the free market is a lack of belief in freedom itself.
There's an important line in there. Quote, "It gives the people what they want instead of what a particular group thinks they ought to want." Some of this is pushing back against a kind of paternalism in government agencies that tells people what they can and can't do, an idea that crosses the line into libertarianism, but conflicts with notions of conservatism today that want to limit things like the influence of social media giants. To put it in TV terms, it's more Ron Swanson and less Jack Donaghy. Friedman painted government involvement as restriction on freedom. That went for everything from school choice to racism, which may be why he wrote against the Civil Rights Act in the intro to Capitalism and Freedom.
That's a place where he chose what he saw was freedom, the freedom to discriminate over equality or equal access to rights and to economic activity. And I think it was a mistake. I think it was mostly born out of ignorance. I don't think he had a really solid grasp of what the social system of the segregated South was. And he didn't care to educate himself on it. And he decided, and it doesn't make any sense to me because this was state sponsored and state sanctioned violations of freedom, personal freedom, economic freedom, basic rights, and that he didn't see it. And I think that was a real blind spot and sort of caused by his paranoia over state intervention, and also caused, I think, just by this ignorance and also this maybe false optimism that, discrimination would eventually fade away in the marketplace. And in part, really the only thing that helps me understand it a little bit more is that, he grew up in a Jewish family at a time when the Klan was still active. He lived through the Holocaust, and then he saw this great opening of opportunity to Jewish Americans in the 50s and 60s. And, he had attained a level of professional and cultural success that would have been pretty much unthinkable in his childhood. And so I think he maybe had a lot of faith that things could really change, and that maybe he thought the segregated South would profoundly change in the absence of government intervention in the way that the fate of American Jews had. But it's not, to me, very convincing at all. He doesn't seem to have harbored deep personal prejudices. So it's just hard to understand. And I guess it just reminds me that I wrote a book about a human being, who didn't get everything right.
Ignorant is a good word. He was not in tune with the widespread racism experienced by people of color in this country. And we're talking prime civil rights movement. When it came to protecting citizens from evil, he defaulted to his vision of freedom. Freedom from government and regulation, rather than considering the lack of freedom for his neighbors who couldn't buy homes in white neighborhoods and may struggle to find safe, well-funded, and academically rigorous schools. Maybe ignorant is too nice. I'll leave that up to you to decide. He so strongly equated lack of regulation with freedom that it kept him from understanding the circumstances of those around him, to the point where he said, famously, "Freedom is my God."
That goes back to this debate about how to manage inequality in a capitalist society. And early in his career, it was more common among conservatives especially to say, inequality is fine. And actually, maybe inequality is even a good thing, that the capitalist system sorts the winners from the losers and shows you who's got it and who doesn't, almost like a bit of a social Darwinist flavor. And those were the people who were greatly opposed to the New Deal. And so when Friedman was thinking about his opposition to the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt and trying to come up with a different take on the Great Depression, he would end up in conversations with these people. But he found that attitude totally abhorrent. He didn't think it was right, first of all. He thought there was an enormous amount of luck and circumstance that went into, whether you received an education that made you competitive, whether you were healthy, all of this type of thing. So he didn't like this, what he called the capitalist ethic. He said that the pure capitalist ethic is like, you get what you get and you deserve what you get, and like, too bad if it's not what you want, or if it's not enough, too bad. And so he really didn't want to say that's his orientation. He eventually decided that freedom was at value, both because he believed in it and because then if you had inequality, you could say it's a byproduct of this greater good, which is freedom. It's not a good unto itself. It's not something we can't try to fix. It's a byproduct. And what we're really caring about is freedom. He often, though, tried to argue capitalism will help create less inequality. For my own work, I felt like we did need to recover this idea that Friedman cared about and talked about inequality, because it really has vanished from his modern profile. But he was not an egalitarian, and it was not his primary value.
Let's circle back to the differences between Keynesianism, essentially, what we did with the New Deal, creating new government agencies, and monetarism, Milton Friedman's small government approach. Because this has some interesting implications for taxes, something that, as we've already covered, the ultra-wealthy of today have found a way to avoid, but we normals have to deal with.
The Keynesian take on the Great Depression was that it indicated a sort of shift in the development of capitalism, in which the federal government had to play a larger role in keeping the economy stabilized. And the way it would play that role was through the taxing and spending powers of the federal budget. And that only the federal government could strategically spend in a way that would bring, broad stability and broad prosperity.
Some of that arm of Keynesianism had to do with questions about what rich people really do with all that money. The theory went that after a certain point, they'll buy their yachts, build beach houses, invest in great works of art, and then there won't be anything left to spend money on. And they'll save their dough. Instead of sparking more manufacturing and industry, that money will just sit there. Keynesianism teaches that wealthy people should be taxed at a higher rate because it would get that money moving again instead of sitting in savings. You see this today with our tax rates in the US, where the richer you are, the greater percent of your income is, supposedly, taxed.
And so previously people would have thought, we shouldn't tax wealth because that's the type of wealth that is invested and makes the economy grow. And the Keynesian said, well, the Great Depression shows that wealthy people might get scared and not spend the money. They might hoard it, or they might not spend it well, or they might not spend it in a way that gets to everyone in society in an equal or fair way. And so that sort of opened the door to a more expansive federal government, economic policy that really targets specific sectors of the economy, this idea that, policymakers and economists can sort of analyze what's going on and fix it through policy.
Friedman had a different idea.
He said this was part of the ordinary business cycle that was made much worse by the Federal Reserve because it mismanaged monetary policy.
In order to prop up the gold standard.
And he supported some of the major reforms to the banking system that were made in the 1930s, like deposit insurance. And then he said, look, what we just have to do is get monetary policy right. And then the same things that have always generated wealth, which is, private economic activity, those will do the trick. And we don't need this bigger government to manage things. And in fact, if this government is too big, it will endanger economic activity and individual freedom.
His theories about people's spending and saving habits were that people stayed consistent even as they grew wealthier. In other words, don't tax the wealthy. They'll continue to spend even as their earnings go up. That's not to say he was completely against the government or taxation. He saw the need for governments to protect their citizens from foreign nations and from harming each other. As he said in an interview on the Donahue talk show in 1979, he wasn't an anarchist. The government should do things like prosecute negligent parents, but, in his mind, it had no place spending taxpayer money preventing suicide, since he saw that as a personal choice that only affected the individual. In that same interview, he said that the government should allow drugs like heroin, which would then drive the cost down, thus, in his mind, reducing drug-related crimes. How society copes with more people on heroin, he didn't say. When Phil Donahue asked him why car manufacturers of the late 1970s weren't making safe cars, Friedman argued that it was because consumers didn't want safer cars. And he did not like consumer advocates like Ralph Nader, who were trying to make products safer, because, he argued, these policies would make things more expensive for consumers, thus hurting them in the long run. It's kind of a heartless mindset. No, it is a heartless mindset, but one that attracted a lot of followers. Okay, so back to capitalism and freedom. He ends a chapter with a list of things he's against. Tariffs, government control of outputs, like limiting how much of one crop a farmer can send to market, rent control, the minimum wage, banking regulation, control of television and radio, social security, licensing a variety of professions, public housing, national parks, and toll roads. Some of Friedman's ideas include some more dangerous notions, like that governments shouldn't regulate pharmaceuticals, believing that the free market would weed out the bad pills. Also that corporations shouldn't make donations to charity, stating that their only social duty was to their shareholders. He was also against taxes on corporations, which he argued would then be passed on to consumers. Do you see how his having freedom as his god shaped his theories? His ideas eventually won him the Nobel Prize in economics, though I feel compelled to note something important. Yes, he won the Nobel Prize, but so have economists all over the spectrum, including socialists and everything in between. The Nobel Prize is sometimes flashed as an explicit endorsement of his ideas, when it's more about academic achievement than saying his model is correct. In the 1960s, Milton Friedman was a celebrity. No small task for an economist. But it still leaves one to wonder, what does this have to do with the Christian church or evangelicals following the Republican Party? In the next episode, we'll examine that question. It's a complicated story with a lot of loose threads. For now, I'd like to circle back to Herbert Hoover riding around in his presidential car, avoiding eye contact with men selling apples on the street. What would you have done in his place? It's hard for people today to grasp just how bad the Depression was. We heard this from Phyllis Schlafly describing her time working in a munitions factory and refusing government help, even looking down on those who took it. But it was truly terrible, especially for farmers. If you'd been in charge, would you have maintained an air of laissez-faire or grown the size of the government to try and help? Some evangelicals, maybe you even know some, would have used Friedman's ideas to justify just driving past. Though even that comes from a flawed understanding of Friedman. Did you know that he was an advocate for the basic universal income, giving government money directly to poor people? We'll cover that in the next episode. The man was complicated. What is the Christian response, if any, to societal or economic problems? Is Jesus our God? Or is freedom? Special thanks to Jennifer Burns. Her book is Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative. It's surprisingly accessible even for someone like me who's just an armchair economics enthusiast. A full list of sources is available on the website at trucepodcast.com. Truce is listener-supported, and this isn't some vast ministry with lots of money. It really is just me. Visit trucepodcast.com/donate for more information, or find the show on Patreon, PayPal, or Venmo me at Truce Podcast. Special thanks to everyone who gave me their voices for this episode, including Lauren Fry and my friend Dave Monroe. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce.